Hello constant readers, my name is Emily. Welcome to the DT Project 17. This is a project in which I read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King for the first time and record my thoughts for the internets. Links to everything will be in the description box down below. This will be a discussion of The Drawing of the Three, which is the second book in the Dark Tower series. It will contain spoilers and it will carry over the questions that I asked in the first video, the questions that I'm asking myself as I'm reading. Just a disclaimer before I start the series. One, this is my first time reading the Dark Tower series, so if I'm saying something, if I'm theorizing something that makes no sense based on your reading of the whole series, that is why. I haven't read the whole series yet. Number two, as I discussed in a previous video, which I will link down below, I am not interested in authorial intentions. I care about what the text as a standalone piece of writing means to me. So in my original video, I offered some analysis of Robert Browning's poem, Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came. If you haven't seen that, it might be worth checking it out. And I connected a lot of that back to fairy tales, which are sort of a splinter of the fantasy genre. And so in fairy tales, the number 3 is very important. Everything happens in threes. And again, we see that here. The title of the book is The Drawing of Three. Roland has to draw 3 people into his party. In the end, Odetta and Detta, who have been these 2 personalities in one body, become 3 people, and that third person is Susanna. They're 3 in 1, which is also very biblical, and I have some questions now. I guess if you're familiar with Christianity at all, you know that God is 3 in 1. So Susanna is now 3 in 1, and I think that's kind of interesting, especially because throughout the book, Detta was surrounded by snake imagery. If you're familiar with any sort of biblical stories, you know that Eve was tempted to eat from the tree of knowledge by a snake, and that caused the fall of humanity. The snake is a fairly loaded literary symbol, and we have Detta being described as very snake-like. I find her character fascinating. I actually want to go back and read Odetta's chapters of the story. So at some point in the future, I would like to do a whole episode dedicated to analysis of Odetta and Detta from this early book. But for this video, I want to focus on the book as a whole and its connections to the fantasy fairy tale stuff. So with the threes, we do see the connection to the fairy tale. And if you remember that the Child Roland fairy tale, 3 is very important. There were 3 brothers. They have to go around the hill 3 times, and they have to chant, open door, let me come in 3 times. So we get that rooting in the 3 when Roland has to find 3 people, go on 3 journeys, and in the end, Odetta merges into 3, becomes 3. I don't know how you want to describe that, but so 3 and the importance of 3 is, I think, definitely linking back to the fairy tale roots of the Dark Tower. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the fantasy and how this series connects to the fantasy. My favorite fantasy scholar, Farah Mendlesohn, she's one of the bigger names in terms of fantasy scholarship right now. So Rhetorics of Fantasy is a text in which she breaks down the types of fantasy literature that there are. The ones that I focused on in my last video were immersive fantasy, in which you start out in the fantasy world and like you just have to go with it. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is an immersive fantasy. They throw you into Hobbiton and you're expected to roll with it. The other type of fantasy that I looked at was the Portal Quest fantasy. Now the Portal Quest fantasy I predicted would become involved based on my knowledge of the Child Roland fairy tale. So in the Child Roland fairy tale, we have a child, C-H-I-L-D-E, which is an untested knight. He goes on this quest to the Dark Tower and he moves through a portal. So I predicted that throughout the series that portal fantasies would be a thing. It's a thing now. So a portal fantasy is usually when you have a mundane, like us, move from our primary world into the secondary world. Now I did discuss these terms in my review of The Drawing of Three, but the primary world, I think Tolkien talks about this in his essay on fairy stories. I will double check that and leave a citation for it down below. There's this concept of the primary world. So the primary world is the world we live in. It's the world we're familiar with. It's the world without magic. And the secondary world is this magical space where it has its own rules, it has its own laws, but it's not like our own. The example I used in my review was Narnia. So the children exist in this World War II primary world with their crazy uncle, and they move through the wardrobe into the magical space of Narnia, in which it's always winter and there's a magical evil witch and animals talk. And that's all normal in the space of the secondary world. Usually, the Portal Quest fantasy has your primary world hero move into the secondary world, go on an adventure, and fix things. The Drawing of Three does the opposite. We have Roland, who is our secondary world hero. When we were introduced to Roland, he existed in an immersive fantasy for us. He existed in this other space, other time, sort of feudal American West that has moved on. And there was magic, there were oracles, there are things that don't make sense in our primary world in Roland's fantasy space. So Roland starts out as an immersive fantasy character. We follow that fantasy character from our secondary world, and he finds a portal and he moves through that portal into the primary world, especially when he takes over the bodies of other people and he interacts with them. Like when we see him interact with the police officers and the gun shop owner and the pharmacist, and he uses Jack Mort as sort of this like computer database, and we see how stunted and awkward and otherworldly he appears. I thought it was interesting that we got that perspective, because here we have the magic leaking out and everybody in the primary world is aware that something is not quite right. So how other people experience their interaction with the gunslinger in the primary world is interesting. Because in the Portal Quest fantasy, the person who moves into the other world is always readily accepted, easily takes over, interacts with people, and everything goes great. They save the day. If you think about Michael Ende's The Never-Ending Story, you have that boy, whose name I'm blanking on right now, move into the fantasy space and he becomes the hero until he wrecks things. You have the children in Narnia who move into Narnia and become the heroes, they become the kings. So in the Portal Quest fantasy, the outsider usually becomes the hero. Whereas in our Portal Quest, where we have the magic leaking out into the primary, our character does not become a hero. He messes everything up and nobody really accepts him. They are very aware that he doesn't fit into the primary world, which I thought was kind of interesting, because if the text is playing and subverting with this fantasy genre trope, I think it does an interesting critique of that idea that the outsider would be readily accepted when they move through the portal. We see that that is not the case. It is far more realistic that the outsider would not fit in to the space that they move into once they've gone through the portal. And I thought that was an interesting way to play with and subvert this fantasy genre staple. One of the questions that I've been asking myself throughout the reading process so far is Roland a hero? Roland is positioned as our hero according to the tropes of fantasy literature. The character that you follow is usually the hero. He's the good guy, you're supposed to like him. Fantasy tends to be very black and white, very little gray area, at least the fantasy staples. I'm sure there are others out there, but in terms of the fantasy staples and what we come to expect of the genre, we do expect very polarized, like Frodo versus the evils of the world, right? When it comes to Roland, who I have always questioned a little bit as our hero, he doesn't have a lot of morals. He is so motivated by his quest for the tower, he will get there at all costs. He's totally willing to sacrifice everybody in his party who he says he loves to get to the tower. We have somebody who's positioned as our hero who doesn't seem to be that sort of like black and white hero. It's really hard to say whether or not Roland is a good character, which is cool. I do like that. And I think Roland's movement into the primary world and how he exists and interacts with that primary world is another place where we really get to question Roland's heroicism. So when we see him with Eddie, he saves Eddie and he works with Eddie to get him out of trouble, but only because he needs Eddie, not because he particularly cares about Eddie as a human. And then we see him with Odetta, and he just steals Odetta with like no questions asked, no really getting to know her. He just pulls her into the world, completely yanking her out of her primary space without her consent. And then we get to Jack Mort, and we see with Jack Mort, Roland realize that Jack is the one who killed Jake. Roland ends up sacrificing Jack. He uses Jack brutally. No consent, no slowly getting to know Jack. He just takes over his body and uses it to get what he needs. And then he kills Jack, which, once we learn that Jack not only killed Jake by pushing him in front of a car, but dropped a brick on Odetta's head as a child and pushed her in front of the subway, causing her to lose her legs as a young woman. That seems like a good thing. Like, you punish the bad guy for their actions, and it seems like a heroic thing to do, to punish the guy who has done bad things. And we see him in his interactions with the police officer and the gun store owner. He might be obtaining them in the weirdest way possible, but he still feels morally obligated to pay for them. And then when he goes to the pharmacy, he pays for his antibiotics. He trades a gold watch for antibiotics. He knows that it's wrong to steal. When the police officer sort of loses it and indiscriminately shoots in the pharmacy, Roland has morals about whether or not that police officer is a good gunslinger. It's that last section with Jack Mort where we really start to see Roland as a more complicated character. We see him really not fitting into the primary world. We really see him as not the hero, but I feel like his actions there really complicate him more. He's still totally willing to use and sacrifice his friends on this quest. This book was fascinating in terms of developing Roland as a character. I am curious to see how his character continues to develop. I think by playing with the genre tropes, this text really asks us to position and reposition Roland and look at him from different angles. I'm fascinated what's happening with the characters at this point, and I'm so excited to keep on reading with the series. That sort of concludes my thoughts on the drawing of the three. Connect with me using the hashtag DTProject17 on Instagram. Like I said before, links to everything will be in the description box down below. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about Roland as the hero at this point? Who is your favorite character so far? Do you have a favorite character? Leave me any thoughts or questions about Odetta as a character at this point. I do really want to put together a character study for her as part of this series. Thank you so much, constant readers, for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye.